On my last trek, I think I was maybe 2 minutes over. So certainly it's a draft. Feel free. I'd be thankful for any feedback, thoughts, suggestions along the way. And of course, happy to answer any questions along the way. I want to talk just real briefly about Q methodology and complexity, specifically in educational research, sort of where it's been and where it's going. I'll say it's really nice to be with a group of Q methodologists who have, if not read the sort of central tomes, then at least are familiar with some of the foundational assumptions of Q methodology. The two that I'll sort of be working with most primarily are first that we're not trying to prove anything, simply we're through Q methodology we try to sort of reveal inherent structures and forms of subjective opinions that participants have. So that we can look at them, basically. And this notion of looking is going to be sort of important throughout, and I'll revisit it at the end. And secondly, that the goal isn't to be able to generalize anything or standardize any process, but rather to engage in this sort of experimental design, research design, to determine sort of some of the structural processes at play. So it's a refreshing change from having to sort of argue your position that Q methodological studies have some sort of ground in a peer-reviewed community. And so for graduate students like myself who have really struggled to get IRB approval with Q methodological studies, I think one of the things that complexity studies offer is an opportunity to kind of address that, which is part of the goal today. So we know that sort of the IRB demands a sort of a validated and controlled stimulus response study. This, of course, has its deep roots in Pavlov, who at the time in Russia proved that dogs drool when they hear a bell ring. But some of his contemporaries, of course, and this has sort of laid the groundwork for a lot of experimental studies in the social sciences, but one of his contemporaries, Lev Vygotsky, sort of questioned that simplicity, that, yeah, sure, it's easy to get data in a lab, but in terms of discovering what's actually happening, it's kind of useless, was sort of what he said. And so he actually got quite a bit of appeal for this challenge of the stimulus response approach. That the job is to study the reaction itself, not the after effect, which he called sort of a fossilized or post-mortem approach of study. And if you know Vygotsky, for those of you who are not educators like myself, he was sort of famous in educational psychology for the zone of proximal development, which is this sort of process by which people can get to places intellectually or developmentally that are beyond their reach with the assistance of knowledge of others and tools. But really the ZPD isn't like a place as we often interpret it. It's sort of more of a process, and in a lot of ways it represents his whole paradigmatic shift from a behavior-oriented approach to studying human development to a process-oriented approach. And he was very explicit that when we study, especially with complex reactions, which is to say any human exchange, then you have to study the process as an entire process. And so by reducing it to a linear objective study, he says it's just useless ultimately. So a little about Vygotsky. I mean, he died really young, and we'll talk about that later. Thankfully, some of his students picked up his work. But he was born in Russia in 1896 and 1934, and if you're familiar with the history, he was involved during the Russian Revolution and sort of became an important figure in communist Russia. And so it's easy to see why his ideas were largely ignored in the United States for the subsequent 50 years. But usually about the 60s or 70s, we came around to understanding this idea of mediation, which is really central to the idea, which is you can't understand an individual without understanding his or her society and culture, and vice versa. You can't understand the culture. That these, any human activity is this complex and mediated act between environment and agent, essentially. And so there is no straight lines, and there is no studying linearity, and it is a sort of a messy mediated relationship. But his students, who sort of carried on after he died, worked really hard to figure out what are these pieces of culture that influence human activity. And they ultimately arrived at what's considered cultural historical activity system, which looks at an activity system as, how the individual agent interacts with the rules and tools of the community in working towards an object with other subjects divided along labor divisions, within that activity system. And it sort of is what leads him to become one of these founding fathers of complex systems. He was thinking about this stuff back in the the 10s and 20s, and it sort of took a while to get a foothold here in the States. But really what he did is he troubled up this stimulus-response relationship, and he said, no, there's always this mediating instrument, that you can't just study something in a controlled lab. And in fact, the mediating instruments are what culture is. So he defines carefully the material and psychological tools that comprise culture, whether it's the physical artifacts and instruments that are used, or the sort of symbolic influences, or the psychological norms And he's most interested in language, just like Q methodologists, because we know with language there's inherent subjectivity. And so there's some issues with interpretation that are ultimately going to problematize methods. So anytime language is involved, Vygotsky and other sort of constructivist developmentalists understand that you can't reduce those things just because of the complex, the indeterminacy that exists between one person's understanding of language and another's, all the way down to sort of our semantic analysis. So the problem with the traditional approaches is this mechanical analysis, which doesn't really pay attention to the process, and it's sort of reified in all the mechanical school as factory metaphors that we use. And so one of the things that complexity researchers argue, picking up Vygotsky's tradition, is to move away from these linear metaphors and towards more organic metaphors of teaching and learning. That human activity is not a factory; that it's in fact kind of unpredictable. And there are general patterns and structures that emerge, but ultimately it's pretty complex. And so the more social scientists looked to the natural world to find metaphors and concepts that framed sort of the social experience, the more complex sort of emerged. And so it was in 1977 when ecological systems theory sort of emerged to look at how social systems sort of replicate some of these, what Bronfenbrenner calls nested systems. And so that within the systems, you can see structures and patterns that emerge that are identical to but interconnected with sort of the broader systems. So it's another way of reaching into sort of the natural sciences for conceptualizations of the social world. And just so you know, I'm interested in looking at how activity theory sort of can give a structure and form to each of those subsystems in a classroom. So the fact is, or the point is, that just because linear causality breaks down doesn't mean that there is no order. It's just that a complex order emerges that sometimes we have to zoom out very far to see, and that includes researchers to look, and that's again why it's important to look culturally and historically at the sort of chrono-systematic elements of human activity. So as we see evolving conceptions from spiral curriculum to these fractalized curricula that exist, and I'll talk in just a minute about quantum sort of approaches, we see complex dynamic systems theories emerge in education that attempt to study every nested system as itself as a complex dynamical system. So, from an individual's mental processes all the way through to sort of, legislative policy are all sort of complex dynamical systems, which can be explored to reveal, this sort of systemic relationships that underlie those relationships. So what happens with the systems approach is you start to see that the world and the universe isn't comprised of things, but it's actually a system of systems, of these sort of interrelated systemic relationships, which are worthy of exploration. And in complex dynamical systems theory, the way they sort of distilled that down was to some of these processes, right? It's unpredictable, but ultimately we know that there's self-organization and emergence, that these two processes sort of coexist in a dialectical relationship. That when agents and environments interact, that there are certain patterns, which are sometimes called global control parameters, that are going to ultimately upon disruption, people are going to reemerge, or agents are going to reemerge into familiar systems. And so, that's why complex systems are often so resistant to feedback. And then there's also this kind of edge of chaos idea of what is happening at that point of complex change that's worth looking at from a complex dynamic systems theory. So in education, complex dynamics theorists have looked at from schema theory all the way through sort of historical changes to the sort of complex messiness of teaching praxis through complex dynamic systems. From the other side, just recently, key methodological studies of education. There was a great review by one of our colleagues here present right now, Renata, who looked at over 70 studies of key methodological approaches to educational research to explore just those types of systems and to really get into this subjectivity, this complexity in education. And so here's sort of where I see the relationship between Q and complexity researchers in education, that there's great opportunities to explore educational phenomena between these two systems, specifically that complex dynamic systems researchers are desirous of new ways of looking at behavior, so that it's not just dissolving things down to linear relationships, which, while they may lead to publications, ultimately lead to no change in professional practice or research practices. And secondly, Q and complexity complement each other to interpret educational phenomena as complex. Again, the complex dynamical systems, this kind of emerging tradition is really desirous of new models to help us understand what complexity means in the broad picture. We already know Q methodology is really, really good at that. For those of us who are here, we understand how factors and Q factors sort of create idiosyncratic relationships, but still that those relationships between and among some of those correlations are worthy of exploration and description. Because again, our job isn't necessarily to prove that something exists, but to describe it in all of its complexity. So again, I think Q methodology really serves well both to explore and to interpret complex phenomena. And I want to end just with this notion of metaphors, right? So one of the things that Dr. Ramlow talks about is quantum theory and how it sort of lends this notion of complementarity by placing two, not necessarily opposing, but different theories next to each other. You can sort of, that's the best way to sort of observe the truth, right? That, or not the truth, that's a terrible word, but to observe basically that you can't observe them directly, right? That if you, that what quantum physics tells us, wave-particle duality tells us, is that the observer has some influence on the state. And so I think for Q methodology, it's fascinating, and they've already sort of, and Q methodology already addresses this in that one, the researcher already situates his or her own perspective by participating in the Q sort, and you can sort of lay that out there. But also it's going to highlight the difference between here are the sort of frames of my own perception and how I've interpreted the work that also exists in the Q methodological study. And so the positioning and placement of those multiple and sometimes divergent viewpoints shows this kind of quantum entanglement that exists, or that, you know, quantum theory posits exists in the natural universe. And so McCowan and Thomas tell us that there are two distinct but complementary purposes for Q methodology. I argue that all studies essentially must do both. From a complex dynamics perspective, if observation influences the phenomena involved, right? If Bohr is correct in his wave-particle duality, then participation in Q methodology insists on the study of itself as an instrument. Educational psychology is a little slow to catch up to this epistemological breakthrough, right? But that doesn't mean that that's not something worth exploring. And as I look through quantum physics and entanglement, I discovered Karen Barat, who's very interested in the double-slit experiment, and particularly as being a metaphor for the kind of complex ways of seeing and knowing and researching and believing in. And she proposes this idea of a diffracted methodology, which I use in my personal research as a kind of a controlling metaphor. This complexity metaphor, how we observe things by not necessarily looking directly at them. And she takes some liberties with the definition, but ultimately to say that it's about disrupting a sort of a clean phenomena in order to reveal underlying constituent components. So, you know, conceptualizing a complex, viewing reflection, for example, as a diffracted experiment so that we can use the Q sort to sort of reveal what kinds of disruptions participants might experience, can lead us to kinds of questions to think about how Q isn't just a way of studying complexity, but of helping participants recognize the complexity in a study. Oh, I have a typo in there, holy moly. So one of the things that I suggest for researchers using Q methodology, thinking complex in a complexity framework, is to consider how Q methodology sort of disrupts a traditional reflective practice in order to sort of reveal some of the underlying constructs that might be entangled underneath. So Q methodology does provide opportunity to study some of these complex causal or reciprocal relationships. And again, it's not about proving anything rather than explaining or describing potential influences. And secondly, we're looking at new ways of expressing these complex processes through new metaphors or new complex multidimensional models that you'll see emerging sort of in the research. So I'm sure I'm well over 2 minutes or 10 minutes, but just to conclude, the sort of two main takeaways is first that Q is a really great agile, and we all know this, right, complete methodology that but I argue that it does contribute to what this emergent CDS tradition needs, both in terms of methodologically, how they approach, you know, conceptualizing and addressing complexity. But also epistemologically, how we can embrace a research methodology that situates itself as resistant by nature to the stimulus response, positivist, traditional approaches to educational research. And then There's also something to offer the other way for those of us like myself who have been struggling to convince IRBs or peer reviewers that Q methodology matters, and that it can be more broadly situated in a more formal academic tradition. CDS theory does offer a flexible framework by which you can kind of situate complex dynamic systems theory and Q methodology specifically as a tool within, or as a complementary device within a systems approach to investigating educational phenomena. Anyone who's interested further, I strongly recommend a look through Kaplan and Garner's Guide for the Perplexed Scholar. It spoke very directly to me, but it's well worth a look for anyone interested in applying a complex dynamics systems approach to any kind of research, actually. I appreciate your time. Any feedback or comments would be greatly appreciated.